Muchas gracias por venir, por cruzar el planeta, por estar aquí en este día.
I'm very sorry I can't speak Spanish. I'm very sorry you have to wear these machines in your ears. And I wish there was a machine that could make me speak Spanish rather than you have to listen to English. So I'd like to thank the translation team, first of all, for translating my words so you can understand them. But I'd also obviously like to thank the organisers of the Congress for inviting me to speak. I think it's a great honour to be asked, and I was very, very pleased to accept the invitation. I think talking to different audiences is one of the privileges of my job, and I really enjoy going to different places and actually listening and learning about how technology is used in other education systems. It's very easy for UK academics to be focused in on the UK and maybe North America and ignore everything else, and I'm really honoured to be able to come and even understand a tiny bit of the research that takes place in Chile. And in fact, Chile is a country that we always look to in the UK for education technology research. There are a small group of other countries that I think have a long history of researching technology and using technology in education. And one of the problems I have with research into technology in education, particularly in the UK and in the USA, is that researchers tend to look too much at technology and far less at education. And by that I mean researchers tend to focus on the technological devices, but also the that surround technology in education. So those people who are interested, for example, in learning and technology tend to focus very much on the technology and the learner and the learning processes which take place between that. And in some ways we tend to imagine technology and learning as taking place in a kind of bubble. Nothing else going on. And also when we think about teachers and technology, we tend to think of the teacher using the technology. Changes have made a difference. Organisations like the World Bank and Bector, who were mentioned previously this morning, will churn out reports showing that there are relationships between technology investment and examination outcomes, student motivation, perceptions of learning, all of these things. Now, unfortunately, most of us who work in education know that this isn't necessarily as straightforward as organisations like Bector and the World Bank would like us to believe. Technology use in schools is far more messy, far more chaotic, far less straightforward than we would like to believe. You could describe this as controlled chaos, but it's chaos nevertheless. There's a lot going on there. Even though technology is being used in the classroom, there are lots and lots of other things going on that don't necessarily relate to technology use. And I think you can characterise the education technology literature as, on one hand, developing the rhetoric of technology use and what technologies could be used for, the potential, but also describing the messy realities of what goes on in practice. And we know that in most classrooms, in most schools, in most countries, technology use remains very limited. The number 1, 2 and 3 uses of technology in British schools are Microsoft Word, Google and PowerPoint. Teaching remains very broadcast. Children's research often involves going on to Google Images and copying and pasting into a Word document, and that's technology use. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm not saying that's a problem, but that's how it is. And it's the same in the UK, in the US. And if we start thinking beyond the kind of industrialised nations, then the idea of technology transforming the classroom, learning, teaching, pedagogy, curriculum, assessment, management, is a nonsense. Schools have remained very, very durable. And aside from the reports produced by the World Bank and Bector, academic researchers know this very well. So, for example, in terms of the Enlaces research, Sanchez and Salinas 2 years ago, this typifies the research findings which are coming out from studies of how this technological transformation has taken place. There's great infrastructure, more teachers have been trained, but as they say, critical results are narrow in terms of classroom learning, and no additional competencies have been observed. And I love this last sentence: results are limited by structural bottlenecks in the educational and social system. Now, those bottlenecks can be all sorts of things, but this is not limited to Chile. These findings are found across the world. So what do we do? Education technology is a compromise. And as I say, there is this gap between the rhetoric and the reality, the potential and the practice. And even the really enthusiastic education technologists are beginning to recognise this. So one of my colleagues in the London Knowledge Lab, Dinah Laurelard, who is a champion for technology in education, in her inaugural professorial lecture a couple of years ago, started off by saying, education is on the brink of being transformed by technology. But it's been on that brink for some decades. And she was talking about how she's becoming tired of being an evangelist for technology and saying the same things. In 5 years' time, this will happen. Change will... You end up becoming tired of promising and never actually seeing. And I think one of the most interesting conclusions in terms of this gap between the rhetoric and the reality is the work of Larry Cuban, the American educational historian, who said, computer meets classroom, classroom wins. And I think that sums up quite nicely how technology and the school come together. Now, education technology researchers are beginning to think of reasons why this may be. And in fact, some of the presentations this morning highlighted this disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality quite well. So one of the main things which technology researchers are beginning to think about is the growing gulf between the students and the schools. So Claudia's presentation, I don't know if she's still here, but was talking about the digital native, and she was describing Chilean school children in terms of their use of games and Facebook and Photolog and YouTube and all of these exciting Web 2 technologies, and then contrasting it with what happens in schools. So it's argued that the students of today maybe are not being represented in their schools, the digital native argument. It's argued as well that teachers are technologically inefficient. They don't necessarily have the competencies or the skills or the vision to use technology well. A lot of researchers use a deficit model of teachers and teaching and technology. It's argued that some of the policies are in fact inadequate, that too much emphasis is put on infrastructure and less on structural change. But one of the main emerging arguments which is coming out of the education technology literature is far more serious than those reasons I've just talked about. And it's fundamentally that schools are conservative institutions that can never change. Simply that schools are not up to the job of teaching for the 21st century. And this argument is becoming more and more prominent and more persuasive in policy circles and in academic circles. And I think it's a very dangerous thing for us to assume and a very, very dangerous thing for us to argue. But if you look at the literature, these are the kind of things people are saying. The idea that schools are structurally unable to change. As Robert Perlman says here, nearly 10 years into the new century, we have the same 30 students sat in a row, listening to the teacher and doing monotonous worksheets. Rather like here, except there's about 100 of you sitting in rows listening to someone talk. We haven't got beyond this broadcast mode of information exchange. And so Perlman and other people will contrast the schools of today with the schools of 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And in some ways they have a point. This, although people look very smart and they all look very studious, there's not much difference between this classroom and the classroom I showed you previously. You can argue that, there are slight differences in the arrangements of the desks and there's a lot more mess. But fundamentally, in terms of power, in terms of structures, in terms of hierarchies, in terms of what's actually going on, maybe Perlman has a point. And I think we've now got to the point in education technology where lots and lots and lots of people are having to work around the school. They're having to make the best of what they see as being a bad situation. And that we're continuing to work, and lots of our research always comes up with the same findings. The technology has potential, but teachers do not have enough time, or enough expertise, or enough fit with the curriculum, or relevance to the assessment regimes. There are lots of kind of very fundamental reasons why the technology is not working. So as I say, I think lots of us, and particularly those of you who are teachers, are just having to work around, and education technology is a compromise. But what worries me is that there are growing numbers of academic education technologists who are just giving up on the school altogether. They're not happy anymore to work around this messy reality. They want something new. And a lot of my colleagues and a lot of the literature that I read now takes a far more radical position on technology in schools. And this is what I wanted to think about, because I think that there's a danger that we're moving into a phase of education technology where we may be becoming divorced from reality. And I think we need to think more carefully about the future of schools and schooling. Now, this idea of giving up on the school comes in lots of different ways. Lots and lots of researchers are beginning to come to the conclusion that technology simply offers a better way of doing education. So as Richard Collins and, I've forgotten his first name now, but Halverson anyway, quite an influential book that came out last year, and I think sums up this argument quite neatly, that we're becoming to a time where schooling and learning become separate things, which is quite a controversial thing to say in the first place, that schools will just be one site where learning can take place, and in fact the home and the community and the workplace and distance education give us lots of different alternatives. And in some ways schools are just one part of the network, one node in the network, for example. Now I'll talk a little bit more about this School 2.0 thesis in a second, but I think other researchers are going even further, and rather than trying to reconstitute the school, are trying to replace it altogether. And so we come up with... I've gone back. I need to go back a bit. I'm rushing on now. That isn't Seymour Papert, by the way. Although I'm sure it... I can't go back. But anyway, one of the arguments... Imagine there's another slide up there with a quote from Seymour Papert. But I think there's been a long-standing kind of anti-school sentiment. So rather than Collins and Halverson saying, well, technology can allow the school to change in terms of its importance, a lot of technologists would actually say that computers will completely replace the school. And there's a famous quote from Papert about computers will blow up the school. The computer will blow up the school. That is, the school defined by something where there are classes, teachers, running exams, people structured by age, following a curriculum, all of that. The whole system is based on a set of structural concepts that are incompatible with the presence of the computer. There's that famous quote by Perlman, Perelman, who argued that putting a computer into a classroom is the same as trying to put a combustion engine into a horse. It just doesn't work. So I think there's been this long-standing kind of anti-school sentiment amongst education technology researchers. These are not recent arguments. These are not fringe arguments. I think this actually lies at the heart of a lot of how some education technologists really believe what they're doing. They're not just trying to make schools better, they're trying to get rid of schools completely. And this always worries me. As soon as anybody tells you that something is inevitable or something's bound to happen and things will change, I always get very suspicious. I'm quite sceptical or quite contrary in that point. I think you don't want to take these predictions of School 2 or anything else at face value. We need to be critical. We need to think critically and think carefully about these supposed future trends. And if there's one thing we do know about education technology, it's that nothing in the future will be certain. There's always been a crisis account about schools. Schools have always been failing. Schools have always been not doing very well. Schools have always not been serving the pupils or students in the way that they should. So in the 1950s, for example, there was great consternation about America's failing schools after World War II. If you look back at the history of education literature from the early 1900s, people were complaining about schools and the way that they weren't operating in the way that they should. And so there's, I think, a long-standing account of schools not working well and technology being the solution. And in fact, Larry Cuban's book in the 80s about teachers and classroom machines showed this very well. And Cuban went back to the early 1900s and showed that there was a succession of technologies that were argued to compensate for the failings of schools. So he talked about the film slide, for example, being the wonder technology of the 1910s and the 1920s. He talked about educational radio in the 1920s and 1930s. He talked about education television in the 1940s and the 1950s. And he talked about microcomputing in the 1970s and 1980s. And all of these technologies, Cuban argued, were hyped up as somehow having the potential of changing schools and reconstituting schools and making them better. So why should it be any different now? Well, if you look at the literature, it's different now because we have the technologies that actually allow us to make the change. Now, I don't personally agree with that. You may not agree with that, but it's worth thinking about these arguments about why is it different. So I think in terms of the present day arguments, there are three main different types of digital technology solution that currently are exciting educational technologists. And I think we need to think very critically about these. We talk about them all the time, and they've kind of become received wisdom. It's kind of assumed that these things are true, whereas I think if you actually stop and think about them for a second, there are problems. But we have virtual schooling, for example. Lots of people have talked about virtual schooling in higher education for the last 20, 30 years. But over the last 10 years, the idea of virtual schooling in compulsory school has taken more importance, particularly in the States, in the US. And this is the idea of using technology, and in particular the internet and virtual learning environments and virtual worlds, using these technologies to set the school free from the physical confines of the building, the four walls of the school. So in some ways we have technology representing the school in a much fairer, much more accessible, much more convenient way. So in the US, for example, the virtual high school movement continues to move apace. It's estimated that 10% of US school children have at least some of their schooling via virtual means. Compensatory lessons, part of the curriculum. And the cyber school movement in the States is becoming big business. Also in the UK, we have virtual schooling, particularly for those pupils who have been excluded or expelled from school. What do we do with problem pupils? We teach them online. But it's becoming a kind of accepted part of technology-based education, that we can give people the choice and flexibility, and we can give the learner widened access to more efficient provision via virtual schools. Now, there's great literature on virtual education, and there's an emerging literature on a slightly different perspective on the future of the school. And this is what I referred to earlier as School 2.0, or we can think of it as re-schooling. And this is the idea that technologies, and in particular social media technologies, Web 2 technologies, allow us to rethink the structures and the processes of the school. And as I say, this is particularly led by the idea of Web 2 technologies such as Wikipedia, YouTube, blogging, the idea that user-generated content, communal creation, and content sharing amongst communities of learners offers a template for the school of the future. Now, as I'm sure you're all sick of hearing, because everybody talks about Web 2 all the time, Web 2 is based on a set of different principles than maybe Web 1, the internet of the 1990s. So we have the 3 C's of community, content, and creation. There's a 4th C, actually, of communication as well. And it's the idea that learning and content creation and knowledge can be created and shared on a many-to-many basis throughout networks which are not reliant on geographical proximity. that people can interact in a way that's not just broadcast, it's interactive, that content can be user-generated, and in fact, it's never finished. And people talk a lot about beta, or beta, as we say in the UK, a beta state of a beta status. So things are never finished. Things can always be improved and re-edited and reconstituted. And all of this stuff. Now, educationalists have taken these principles and argued that we can have School 2.0. And so this is from the Apple Classroom of Tomorrow 2, because the Apple Classroom of Tomorrow 1 wasn't obviously good enough, ACOT 2. And they talk about the need to use these principles to rethink skills. So we talk now about 21st century skills. You don't need to know how to find information. You need to know how to create information. You don't need to know how to find information. You need to know how to remix education and put things together and form your own new form. All of this stuff. People talk about rethinking the curriculum. Mash-up curriculum is one of the ideas, that you as the teacher do not set the curriculum, the learners make their own curriculum. That's a dangerous idea. Assessment it's argued that we need to rethink assessment for the 21st century. If knowledge and information is being created by groups of people, how do we assess that? We don't just assess individuals, we assess groups, so we rethink assessment. We have peer assessment, learners assessing each other, all of these things. And everything from culture and emotional connection through to actually the fact that access to learning should take place on a 24/7 basis. All of these things add up to what education technologists are now referring to as School 2.0. And when I first heard these ideas, I was shocked how seriously they were being taken. And the more I talked to people, academics, policymakers, even educators, this discourse is becoming more and more influential. So the school is just one part of the learning process, as that quote from Collins and Halverson intimated. The school is linked with the community, parents, employers, the library, everywhere. The community is the learning hub. Now, I think you may be familiar with these first two lines of argument. This third line of argument is becoming more prevalent, although it's often not talked about so widely, but it's the idea of technology completely replacing the school. So if the second School 2 arguments can be called reschooling, this is deschooling, and actually very much along the lines of Illich and the idea of deschooling from the early 70s. But it's the idea that social media technologies, in particular social networking, can allow learners to learn amongst themselves without the need of the school at all. And at the moment, I think this is a more academic than a kind of practical set of practices. But there's growing talk about using technology to replace the structures and the processes of schooling. As I said, learners learning within a community of co-learners. No one is a teacher. Everyone can be a teacher and a learner. People talk about the wisdom of the crowds. Charles Leadbeater wrote quite an interesting book called We Think. Just-in-time learning, open learning. Now, as I say, there are parallels here with the work of Illich, but there's also parallels with the unschool movement, the non-school movement, the homeschool movement, the idea that anywhere is a school, apart from the school itself. Now, there are emerging examples of this as well. This isn't complete science fiction. In the UK, the school of everything is often touted as a different model for schooling. And this is basically just a social networking site where people go online and they say what they want to learn, they say what they want to teach, and people get together. My name's Neil. I would love to learn to speak Spanish, particularly at this moment, and I can teach you how to play the guitar. And you might say, my name is Magdalena. I want to learn to play the guitar. I can help you speak Spanish. Why don't we get to... And the argument is that this can take place via technology. Now, it's interesting that the things that tend to get offered on the School of Everything are driving lessons, computer lessons, and what goes on in schools anyway. But it offers a model, a different model to technology in education and schooling. One supporter of it described it as an eBay for stuff that doesn't take place in schools. Now, all of these scenarios are very seductive. They show nice, shiny new technologies. They're very exciting. It's very difficult to find an educational technologist that would disagree with all of those examples. They're highly appealing. As I say, in some ways they're becoming the norm. They're becoming received wisdom amongst a lot of educational technologists that I work with. But these are not just technical adjustments to schools and schooling and education. All of these proposals actually talk about huge cultural and social and political and economic shifts to education. And I think there's a danger that as educational technologists, if we take these ideas too seriously at face value, that we'll just sleepwalk into trying to re-engineer whole school systems without properly considering the wider implications of what these visions of the future actually imply. And at best, I think we'll be disappointed. We'll continue to be disappointed in Cuban's idea of hype, hope and disappointment. But I think at worst, we'll become more marginalised within the education technology community. I had an argument with a colleague in the Institute of Education last month where he said all that we did was science fiction. Now, if he was to hear these arguments, some of these things sound like science fiction to me. So I think we need to actually think more carefully about schools and technology. Now, that's not to say that no change is needed. We know that change is needed. We know that the schools and the classrooms that we've talked about earlier are not perhaps perfect and could be improved. So I'm not saying that nothing needs to take place, but I think we need to actually think more carefully about how change does take place. It's not as easy as those slides would have you believe. It's not going to be as smooth as some people would like us to believe. So in some ways we need to come up with an education technology 2.0. Rethink what it is that we do, and also rethink how we approach technology and education. And I think there are a number of problems with the way that we're thinking about the future of schools and technology. Now, you may disagree with all of these, but at least it will hopefully help us think about doing things in the future. But I would argue that a lot of education technology is driven by a very narrow set of concerns, values and agendas. And in particular, the argument or just the belief, the inherent belief that technology will somehow change education. This technological determinist view that technology is somehow capable of changing social realities of schools. I think this is very, very dangerous. And it often pushes us into what's called a technical fix mentality, where actually technology is then held up as a way of overcoming big social problems. Technology is a solution to social problems. The most extreme example of this, I heard yesterday on the news that India is planning a biometric, a complete countrywide biometric census of all of its citizens. 1.2 billion people will have their irises scanned, and then they'll have digital passports that allow them to... And that's just nonsense. In a country like India, with 1.2 billion people, most of whom the state don't know about, the argument that technology will fix kind of social security problems is nonsense. But I think in schools as well, there's a danger that we have this narrow agenda of technology changing things. There's also, I think, a narrow agenda of education, really meaning learning and teaching. And I think there's a narrow agenda of when we think about learning, as thinking about learning along social cultural lines. There is more to life than Vygotsky. And I think we need to think more broadly. Oh God, you didn't like that, did you? But I think we need to think more widely about technology, education and learning than the ways that we do at the moment. I think there's also a problem with these current discussions of over-romanticising the informal. Informal learning, digital practices, informal use of technology. This is where most education technologists see the future as lying. I think there's a lot that's wrong with the informal. There's a lot that could be said for formal learning actually having strengths, which I think education technologists are too quick to reject. It could be argued that the formal curriculum, for example, plays an important role in imparting high-status, powerful knowledge, the things that you need to know in order to succeed in society. One of my colleagues, Michael Young, always talks about, I think it was Foucault who said, you don't know what you don't know. So the idea of actually being told something in a formal way can be quite empowering. Not all knowledge needs to be discovered or created amongst communities of learners. There is a value actually in just being, as I say, in being told stuff. Not all learning needs to be fun. Some learning can be hard. I mean, I think there's a danger that we get rid of a lot of things which maybe have strengths just because of the allure of the informal. And I also think the current debates about schools and technology in some ways legitimise a range of other agendas which we perhaps didn't intend. And this idea about technology allowing learning to be individualistic and individually driven and individualised worries me. The idea that learning can be a private thing that the individual takes place and does in different ways moves us away from, I think, a lot of the strengths of communal public education, that for all of its faults does make sure that public education is a public good and a collective responsibility. When we begin to privatise and individualise learning, there are a lot of other agendas which then latch on to technology and education. And it's interesting that virtual schooling has been taken, the most interest in virtual schooling has taken place from the private sector, those that can actually then sell schooling and make money. And also, as Michael Apple has recently shown, in the US at least, fundamentalist Christian homeschoolers that don't want their children learning about theory of evolution, for example. Now you can teach whatever you want and not having the state. I think those are all quite dangerous. And I also think that these scenarios I showed you are also silent on a number of important issues, such as fairness and social justice. Who wins and who loses? It's not this brave new world where everybody learns in a perfect way. Not all connections are equal. We know, for example, about Web 2 technologies. If we look at Wikipedia, some people gain from Wikipedia more than others. There's this 1% rule, isn't there, where 1% of people, in terms of social media, social software, 1% will create something. 9% will maybe edit it or share it, and the other 90% will just passively consume. So in terms of Wikipedia as an educational tool, the 1% who are making things and the 9% who are editing, and no, they're gaining a lot more than the 90% who just read it like they would any other text. So there's a danger that we ignore the fact that these are all unequal. Some people gain more in a community than others. Some people will learn more, all of these things. And also, I think another silence is the role of the commercial and private sector. None of these things, just technologies, come from God. They're all made by mainly private companies. In the UK, for example, we're very proud that the BBC, the state public broadcaster, is getting involved in virtual education, virtual learning. BBC have a bite-size website where the majority of UK school children go online, and when they're not at school, they engage in other learning activities and they revise for exams and they do their homework. This is seen to be a great thing. There's a lot more concern, however, about a similar thing in Australia, which is run by McDonald's, the McDonald's Maths Online. Now, as they say, over 1 in 2 students in Australia use Maths Online to learn maths. Why are we more worried about McDonald's than we are the BBC? My point is that virtual education lets in a whole other range of interests and organisations and concerns into education. Now, that might not be a bad thing, but it's certainly something we need to think about. Now, all of these examples, I think, and all of these problems point to the need, I think, for more attention and more thought and more scrutiny in the area of digital technologies and education. And I think in some ways we need to think about the roles that education technology research has to play in moving beyond these stories and coming up with more satisfactory arrangements. And so I wanted to finish the talk with 10 commandments. 10 commandments normally work quite well, don't they? But I could only come up with 9 commandments. And they're not really commandments, they're more just suggestions and, Anyway, an agenda for change. I think the first 5 are actually quite easy for us to do. But when we're thinking about the future of technology and education, obviously we need to distinguish between rhetoric and reality. One of the most interesting questions to ask is what is actually new about this new technology? What is actually new about getting learners to work together on a project collaboratively? Isn't that what we used to do 50 years ago? What's new about allowing people to reflect their thoughts in a blog as opposed to a diary, for example? Nobody reads either, but not romanticising the informal. I think, again, that's easy to do. Resisting the technical fix. Hopefully we've all moved beyond that way of thinking. And looking beyond learning. In other words, thinking about education from its wider perspectives. And again, I think one of the talks this morning, the last talk, actually pointed out all of the different things beyond the learner and learning. But my last 4, because I could only come up with 9 commandments. If you can think of a 10th commandment, I would really be grateful about that, because I think this will make it much more powerful. I think there are 4 other things perhaps we should think about doing. Building a better body of research. I think there's far too much anecdote in education technology research and far less evidence. A lot of education technology research is just basic case studies and reporting of best practice and what could happen. I think we need far better empirical research which uses far broader methods than at the moment. Ethnographies, meta-analysis, randomised controlled trials. All of these methods are used by other education researchers. They're far less prevalent within the technology community. And the other thing is interdisciplinarity. There are lots of other people in other rooms here who need to get involved in education technology research. The neuroscience research on learning and technology, for example, at the moment it's just assumptions. Historians of technology, cognitive psychologists, school leadership and management researchers. There are all sorts of research communities which I think need to get involved with education technology. But I think we also need to think more carefully about these last 2. Acknowledging the politics of education and technology. A lot of these questions and a lot of these assumptions, a lot of these arguments are actually to do with values and ideology. What is education for? What education do we want in the future? And these are things that technology alone aren't going to tell us. So I think we need to repoliticise this area. And last of all, make education technology a mainstream issue. The thing that really, really depresses me is that most people don't care about education technology. Most of the discussions we've had in this room over the last 2 days, most people don't care about at all. I think these changes and these technologies are so important that we need to move beyond educational technologists talking to themselves in their own conferences, in their own journals, online. It's amazing how most of the hype about Web 2 takes place via Web 2 tools. So we have people using blogs to talk about blogs and how great blogs are to other people that read blogs. And most people don't read blogs. So none of these discussions really take place. We need to make education technology a big conversation, a debate amongst teachers and education technologists, companies, students, the mass of people that don't use technology. One of my big bugbears is that over the last 5 years in the UK, the most big educational issue has been school meals and the quality of food in schools. Jamie Oliver, you may have heard of him, I saw him last night on your telly, had a big campaign, the government got involved, parents got very involved, there was such passion about school food. Why can we not have a similar thing about technology? I'm serious about this, but every time I say this, people laugh. But anyway, there we are. So anyway, I gave a talk 2 months ago in North America, and they said, that's all very well, but what is your take-home message? So I thought, what is my take-home message for this? And I think if there is a take-home message, it's that we can't really afford to sleepwalk into the future of technology and education. I don't want to just go through the motions of Web 2 and social media in schools. As I say, we need some big debates about this. What education do we want? What is education for? And I think all of these things are big questions that technology will not provide the answer to. We actually need to work probably even harder to work through the next 10 years. So, thanks very much, and we're happy to do some questions.
Thank you, Neil. Muchas gracias. Tenemos tiempo para unas pocas preguntas del público. ¿El micrófono dónde está? Allá.
Yes.
Manos, tenemos una mano por allá. Concursante número 1.
¿Se escucha bien? ¿Sí?
¿Escuchas bien la traducción? Sí.
Sí.
La pregunta es, ¿qué piensa del futuro aporte que puede involucrar la inteligencia artificial sobre la educación? Digo, hay experiencias como en Estados Unidos, a través del Instituto de Inteligencia, del Sistema Inteligente de Memphis, o en Stanford, digamos, a través de Daniel Schwartz, el laboratorio AAA. Por ejemplo, ¿cómo ve ese aporte a futuro para la educación?
I think, artificial intelligence has lain at the heart of education technology over the last 50 years. So even people like Minsky in the 60s, a lot of the education technology discipline comes from artificial intelligence. But it seems to me that AI researchers have just been operating in a silo or a bubble away from education technology researchers. And so one of the important things is getting all of the people who work on technology and education together and talking to each other. And I've begun to work with AI people in the London Knowledge Lab, and we have some great artificial intelligence researchers who do some brilliant things. But getting them to think beyond the actual technology itself is very, very difficult. We have a fantastic project that's used AI to help students with dyslexia, and they've built this amazing pedagogic agent and this amazing system. But to test it, they brought in 5 school children from a local school into the university to use the technology. And they found out that it worked very well. And one of my main questions was, why did you not bring the technology into the school to see how the technology would work in the social setting? But they weren't interested in that. Their funding only depended on them making the technology. The funding didn't depend on the technology working. So in some ways, the work that artificial intelligence researchers are doing and sociologists are doing, it's all very, very good. But it's joining it up, both within the university, but also I think at the policy level as well, the way that research is funded. I would hate to recommend that no one gets any education technology research funding unless it's interdisciplinary. But on the other hand, I think researchers should be made to engage with other audiences. A lot of what we're talking about here in terms of technology and learning does relate to cognitive psychology, neuroscience. There's all sorts of things that need to be researched. But there needs to be conversation as well. There's no point doing this research without everyone actually understanding it and using it.
Hello? Oh, yes. My name is Jaime Sanchez. I'm very interested in talk. I just wanted to take one point of your last slide in terms of the research. If you think that computer education was born early 60s, so we're talking about a field that is 50 years old. So every 5 years, every 10 years, you start seeing in the literature people saying that we need more research, we need strong evidence, etc. So after 50 years, we still are talking about the same emphasis that we need a better body of research. I agree with you with that idea, but my question is, what do you think about this? If you can elaborate a little more about it, and also what is the people in your country, in UK, doing about it?
Why am I putting this on? There's no need for me to listen to this. I thought I was going to speak Spanish to myself. There is an argument that's often used by technologists that the internet is only in its infancy, for example. So if we compare it to Gutenberg and the printed word and the Gutenberg press, we wouldn't, after 50 years, have expected the printed word to be doing anything. It's only 200 years after the event that we can see its full significance. So there is an argument that we shouldn't be researching these things. We should just let them happen, see what happens, and it's not a mature field of research. I think there has been a tendency for us to try and move very quickly. I was reminded that there was, I forget who it was, but it was one of Chairman Mao's sidekicks in the Chinese Revolution who was asked, what was the significance of the French Revolution? And he said, we don't know yet, which is quite an interesting way of thinking about it. So perhaps we're trying to run before we can walk. I'm not sure. I certainly think that there is been a tendency to over-research technology in education, and in particular put too much credence to the findings of the research projects. So as I say, I think there's a tendency to try and prove things and look for causal effects as opposed to correlations before we're actually in a position to do that. And I think, again, I'm not sure that the British education technology community is doing anything about that at all. I think we're just as bad, and in some ways we're responsible for a lot of the problems in this area. So I think perhaps there needs to be less hype and less expectation and just allowing these things to evolve naturally and see what happens. Could I also say, not that I was going to say this up there, but the UK has seen itself as leading the world in education technology research, and I think lots of great things have happened in the UK. But with the new government that we have now, the funding has been cut from Vector, it's been cut from schools, it's been cut from a lot of places. So if you want to look for future cutting-edge education technology practice, and maybe even research, I'm beginning not to look at the UK. I would look at Norway, I would look at the US, I would look at Australia. I think things are going to change very, very quickly, so I wouldn't even bother what the UK are doing. I would look elsewhere. I may emigrate, actually.
Hola, yo tengo dos preguntas que se refieren un poco a la situación internacionalmente, específicamente en el Reino Unido. La primera es la siguiente. Usualmente tenemos, los que trabajamos en educación, vemos un bombardeo constante, una presión constante para incluir tecnologías dentro de las salas. Y hay relativamente pocas voces hablando en contra de esto. O sea, hay mucha presión para incluir la tecnología, pero aquellos que opinan que la tecnología debería incluirse más lento o no incluirse o cualquier opinión distinta, parecen tener muy poco espacio en la discusión. Entonces me gustaría saber internacionalmente qué sucede al respecto. La segunda pregunta es un poco parecida. En algún momento mencionaste que estaríamos dirigiéndonos en la dirección de separar el aprendizaje del colegio, esencialmente, el aprendizaje del schooling. De cierta forma yo esperaría que esa separación, si llegara a darse, estuviera guiada por las exigencias del mercado. Entonces, nuevamente me gustaría saber, a nivel internacional, particularmente en el Reino Unido, hasta qué punto el mercado, y particularmente el mercado laboral, ha incorporado o no lo ha hecho las facilidades que hay hoy en día para el, qué sé yo, el autoaprendizaje o algo por el estilo, ¿no? El aprendizaje fuera de las instituciones académicas.
No, I think those are two very important points. I mean, very quickly, I think there has been a danger for there to be a big push on technology and education rather than a pull. In some ways, a lot of the education technology changes have been supply side rather than demand side. Teachers have not been saying, we really want this amazing technology. It's been pushed on them. And as you say, there are very few voices who would argue against this. And in the UK in particular, and in the States, the voices that have been raised against education technology tend to be very, crazy arguments. So the agenda about child safety and risk and paedophiles and cyberbullying, and the voices against education technology change tend to be very extreme. And so we've got this position where lots of people are very positive, utopian, lots of people are very negative, dystopian. There's no one in the middle saying, hang on a minute, things are more so this is what I meant about getting more people involved. We want to not just have the real enthusiasts and the real no-hopers. We need the majority of teachers, the majority of parents who are maybe don't have extreme views about technology and education to get involved. Otherwise we'll be locked in this kind of black and white yes and no argument. And again, coming to your second question, you could argue that learning and schooling have always been separate. Most of the most interesting learning I've ever done took place outside of the school. So what's new there? And this idea about employers and work-based learning taking up the slack. Employers often complain about schools not being very forward-thinking in education, and the fact that they then have to teach employers to do things on the job. But work-based training, and particularly the use of technology in work-based training, is even more low-level than in schools. It's all about e-learning in the very worst sense. So in some ways, if I was a private education technology company, I would be concentrating on work-based training as a place. And I think a lot of the ideas that we're developing within our community, we need to think about the workplace, as well as the university, as well as the school, as well as the community. Because the quality of work-based training is even worse. So I'm just being very negative, aren't I? I'll think of something positive to say at the end.
We are over.
We've had enough fun.
Me dicen que no tenemos más tiempo. Muchas gracias, Neil.